Mapungubwe Interpretation Center, Limpopo. Duality of life can be hidden under a mask. In Jonathan Noble's book, White Skin, Black Masks, he uses direct reference to the African identity in post-apartheid public architecture. The tension created between the mask and the skin is similar to honest identification and a deceptive facade created by a mask. Noble addresses post-colonial architectural theory, making direct reference to it. There is a definite link between culture, politics, and architecture that is represented in Noble's work. Democratic, cultural, and political response to the given surroundings is to be addressed in whether the design of the building responded to what its surroundings demanded, as well as the expression of how aspects have been maintained and lost through colonialism in our given topic. A starting point in Noble's discussion is the opposing metaphor, black skin, white masks, a subjective issue to colonial racism, based on dominant versus repressed forms of architectural expression. By the analysis of hybridity, it starts to reveal the intent behind the mask. Diagrammatic representations, plans and sections, motive making, and fragmentation will reveal the example of post-apartheid public architecture. In further discussion of the intent and location, spatial configuration, identity, materiality, imagery, and memory of meaning. The question arising in post-apartheid South African context is whether it can be defined in an inauthentic or authentic manner through architecture by analyzing the Mapungubwe Interpretation Center in Limpopo.
Intent and location. The pre-existence of traditional African states and kingdoms has always been a very controversial issue in South Africa during the time of apartheid. These kingdoms were oppressed, secluded, and isolated from the culture that was enforced during apartheid. However, when this regime ended, the South African government decided to emphasize the legacy of those kingdoms. A UNESCO World Heritage Site and a game reserve, the Mapungubwe Interpretation Center is located in Muzina in Limpopo. It is situated on South Africa's northern border, roughly 10 kilometers from the border of Botswana and Zimbabwe. Sited at the junction of the Limpopo and Sachet rivers, the park was assembled from a collection of private land within the last decade. The Mapungubwe civilization, from 1200 to 1300 AD, whose ruins were discovered in 1932 on Mapungubwe Hill, traded with Egypt and Asia, developed mining for gold and agriculture, and was the first African state to have social class distinctions. The civilization was the precursor to Great Zimbabwe. This rich trading history was the motivation behind the construction of the center, as native communities requested the return of the remains and artifacts removed from Mapungubwe in the 1930s after the fall of apartheid in 1994. The design for the center was then the result of an invited design competition held by South African National Parks in 2005. The proposals needed to provide about 3,000 meters squared of exhibition space for the artifacts of the Mapungubwe Kingdom, interpretive areas for the cultural and natural significance of the park, headquarters for the park staff, and amenities for visiting tourists. The winning proposal was by Peter Rich Architects, Michael Rummage, and John Oschendorf. It was designed to act like another stone hill within a context of stone hills, which resulted in the building being integrated in such a way that, at first sight, it is not very easy to spot when arriving from the 10-hour drive from Johannesburg. Along with the architectural requirements of the competition brief, the agenda took a step further to engage the local population with the realization of the project, in an effort to create employment and inject money and skills to the local community surrounding the parklands. This would suggest a new model for the interaction of architecture and development. The winning proposal responded to this requirement from Sand Parks with a labor-intensive design that employed local people for a year, making tiles on site from the surrounding earth, as well as teaching the local people how to construct the project using those tiles. This resulted in the project being driven by simple materials, being made on the site, and having the local community comprise the workforce. The reliance on local labor for the center improves livelihoods of the surrounding communities and provides a skill base for future projects. The idea was to involve the local community into the project, providing them with employment and enhancing their skills. In this way, the center was firmly rooted in both the site, as most of the construction material was from the surrounding area, and the local indigenous people of the area. The objective given in the competition brief was to provide the national park with an interpretation center that could give the visitor a very clear understanding of the importance of the Mapungubwe region and all the different African kingdoms and cultures that existed there. It was for this reason that the center was built 1 kilometer away from where the original archaeological site was discovered and excavated in the 1930s. In this way, the center celebrates the site of the ancient trading civilization. The center was constructed with the intention of merging the natural location with the park's cultural heritage by using modern, environmentally sensitive techniques. The idea was to integrate the building with the cultural, natural, and historical landscape of the area. The goal from the very beginning was not to reference any specific African culture or kingdom with the appearance or design of the complex. The only reference to any African kingdom was to the Mapungubwe kingdom, and this was done mostly by the choice of sites and by the housing of the artifacts rather than any architectural reference. No traditional decorative motifs were used. This was very important because of the many different ethnic groups that claimed traditional ownership of the land, and in order to avoid any controversy by any native group, reference to any local culture was avoided. It was for this reason, among others, that Peter Rich Architects won the design competition, as their proposal referenced the landscape of hills, rocks, and valleys, rather than any African group. This complex landscape surrounding the project was both the inspiration for the design and the source of most of the materials for its construction, resulting in a composition of structures that are authentically rooted to their location. The whole design and architecture of the building was focused on its integration into the natural landscape of the site. The project's agenda extends beyond the presentation of history. The problem of a remote site, coupled with a high local unemployment rate, also had to be taken into account. These are manifested in the choice of technology, the language of the building, the materials, and construction process. Thus, the center is not only emblematic of the site, Africa and its unique place in the origin of the world, but has also become part of a story that is still unfolding, of culture developing in symbiosis with its natural legacy.
Moving on to topic 3, spatial configuration, where we will be identifying and explaining the different type of connections between spaces. Set in a spectacular but remote fault landscape, Mapungubwe Center exemplifies a contemporary African architecture that gives cultural significance in how buildings interrelate and integrate with the environment. The complex rocky landscape was both the inspiration for the design and the source of materials, creating structures that are authentically rooted to their location. The architecture gives us unusual and imaginative exhibition spaces for disseminating the intricate history of successive civilizations who have occupied this area from the 9th century until the present. But it also raises awareness of the vulnerability of the local ecology and the importance of its preservation. The building shows a naturalistic expression, one that grows from the semi-barren landscape, intense, still, and sublime, giving a connection as an apparent landmark to all lands and hilltops around it, just like the Mapungubwe mountain. The vast tracts of fault, with rifts of beautiful native trees such as the fever tree and the remarkable baobab, alternate with the valleys, flat-topped hills, jagged horizontal ledges, and groups of roundy, stony hillocks. The synergic experience of the building connects to its land, as if rising from the terrain. Looking closer into the building, a series of equilateral triangles structures the landscape and the way the building addresses it. The triangles are designed around an axis linking the centre's entrance and the archaeological excavations. This axis traverses the site, running parallel with the hilltop ridge and rivulet below. It is not obviously articulated, but nonetheless provides a subconscious appreciation of the ordered way in which buildings are grouped, and the informal flow of outside spaces and planned landscape elements between them. The significance of the triangle is its connection to the local vendor culture, where it was a common arrangement to have 3 dwellings placed in an equilateral triangle and linked with low walls. There were also isolated triangles carved into stones at the nearby archaeological site. The architect devised a timbral vaulting system consisting of 3 vault types along with the triangle system. These vaults resembled a system of caves, which is culturally significant. Caves were regarded here not only as places of refuge and shelter, but were also used ritually in rainmaking ceremonies. Contrasting to the internal spaces, the shaded areas and covered walkways bind together the landscape spaces between them, which are planted with indigenous species of the surrounding veld, so nature seems to flow through the structures, just like that between mountains. And on to topic 4, movement composition, where we'll be explaining the user's movement through the building and what type of experience is generated with this. The arrival. Set at the foot of a mesa, we meet the park entrance. The building is visually contained by 3 hollow cones that evoke rock root makers commonly found in South African cultures. From a distance, the undulating rock-clad vaults blend into the landscape, where on approach, the thin arched edges are exposed and the vaults soar above the ground. The slightly sloping ground helps to make the various pavilions look even more like natural outcrops, billowing out of the earth. The sloping terrain is an integral part of the architectural design, providing a series of viewpoints along the paved routes set between dry stone walls and from the terrace seating carved out of the hillside. Now at the entrance gate, Mapungubwe Center is approached through a valley from where the outcrop of the new buildings merges naturally into the southern slope of a rocky plateau. From here, there is a view to a hill about 1 km away, where the original archaeological site was discovered and excavated. The clever analysis of the site and the way it is structured to accommodate the program becomes more apparent as you move from the entrance in the valley to the plateau 14 meters above. From here, the whole complex is revealed and linked visually to the archaeological site on the hill beyond. Entering. Arriving at the parking area, tactfully obscured by a hillside spur, you move past an outdoor introductory exhibition to cross the open veld to a group of shade-providing trees with views of the south elevation. A sloping bridge brings you to the reception cone, which is punctured by an oculus so the sun's light bathes the interior. A freestanding vault generously spans the space between the ablutions and the restaurant facilities. Here we find the visitor's first view across a seasonal stream, the principal vault springing directly from the land on a robust buttresses, setting the volume and tone for the site. The volumes near the reception are linked by terrace seating, contrasting structured horizontality of the contours with the sheer domes and arches. The surfacing of all the masonry and local rubble stone creates a timeless quality, with nature rising once again to a singular large rockfall. From the reception area, a darkened passage curves around the cairn to an inclined, elevated walkway with a slatted timber floor and mesh-screen balustrade, leading us to the entrance of the historical facility. The stone walling technique used in the building of the centre was adopted from the native method prevalent in the Mapungubwe area. The light and shade inside gives itself to the shapes and patterns of the world around the building in an African environment, in the closed under shade of a fever and remarkable baobab trees, with the alternating open veld valleys, stony ledges, and roundy stone hills. Mapungubwe is a fascinating landscape. Shaded by tall trees on either side, you reach a heavy, stone-clad, sloping buttress marking the threshold to the crypt-like exhibition areas. In these spaces, vaulted tiled soffits exhibit the faces of people who have been part of the historic continuum of Mapungubwe. The main vaults. Passing through a sequence of different spaces, vaguely aware of the triangular ordering system, as you ascend through the building, you finally arrive at the generous vaulted exhibition area at the building's summit. Shaped by natural structural forces, large vaulted spans can be achieved with minimal roof thickness, achieved through local materials and simplicity of construction, allowing unskilled labor, which was a common trait. Timber vaults are ancient structures originating in the Mediterranean region 600 years ago and are still in use today by the Catalans. Large areas cut out of the vault admit a soft, almost sacred half-light to the exhibition area. The experience of the internal exhibition space is cavernous, articulated by the exposed tiles made from the local soil. Light is filtered through fuse-colored glass with dappled patterns reflected from the ponds that cool the air that naturally ventilates the buildings. These openings are protected from glare by polycarbonate sheeting and eucalyptus stalks, and from baboons with iron grills based on the pattern of cunardate plants growing in the courtyards below, creating the feeling of stepping out of a cave and seeing the landscape ahead. The external terraces are shaded by horizontal slats to create areas reminiscent of the traditional African gathering space, or khutla. Curving in two directions, the lofty, undulating vault bears lightly on the side walls. Colored light falls through the glass panels on the south wall, and the famous golden rhino, one of Mapungubwe's most precious treasures, shines in its own impressive display cabinet. Its serenity prevails, unifying artifacts, architecture, and nature. Space and light resonantly connect the building with the site and history, evoking wonder at the memory of so many civilizations that walked the earth before we did. The final movements. As visitors move from the main vaults, they have a choice of ramp and stair, internal and external, to move into the upper parts of the vaults and appreciate the privileged view of the lower volume, as did the ancestors from the elevated position on the plateau of the hill. The route continues outside the covered spaces, leading to the highest part of the site and affording a view across a flat expanse to Mapungubwe Hill in the distance, with its backdrop of Limpopo. As you experience a sequence of delicate walkways with changing directions and ramped routes throughout the entirety of the building, the orientation and variety of structures from lightly covered walkways to vaulted spaces, all punctuated by open courtyards, landscaped with rocks, plants, and pools, you can only marvel at the ingenious organization of a complex and historically potent site. All this comes underpinned by a strong social dimension, ending with a gradual climb to the mesa, to the highest point of the site, providing the visitor with a multiplicity of experience and views, evoking the complex social interactions of the many cultures that have traversed the land.
Identity can be described as many things, as each person's view on identity will differ. Architectural identity is somewhat similar, but however, we can gather a shared understanding of this identity through different aspects of each specific building. In analyzing this building, I found it easier to explain identity through the three most crucial aspects of this building, these being structural identity, material identity, and contextual identity. Starting off with structural identity. The structural technique used is timbral vaulting, which is commonly used outside of South Africa, in Northern America and Europe. Timbral vaults are often found in sacred buildings, such as churches and public buildings. So when one is to describe the structural identity of the Mapungubwe Interpretation Center, it is very clear that it is of a Western nature. Secondly, the material identity. The material identity begins to highlight the use of African building techniques, which is the making of earth bricks. When thinking back on identity, these bricks, all uniquely made by local masons, gives the building a strong sense of African identity, as the bricks are made from the very earth that acts as the base foundation of the building. Thirdly, the contextual identity of the building. Contextual identity starts to bring in this motion of coexistence. The coexistence of the building and landscape working together, as one is not trying to overpower the other, and the building is merely an extension of the landscape. With reference to Jonathan Noble's book African Identity in Post-Apartheid Public Architecture, White Skins, Black Masks, he describes identity and expression through four principles, which include imaginative dialogues, symbolic inversions, hybrid authenticities, and double symbols. Through the analysis of these three aspects, imaginative dialogue starts to expose itself, as its definition is, the recognition of multiple cultures, their differences, and histories. If the architectural identity of this building had to be defined in one word, it would be coexistence. Coexistence of the Western techniques and the African materiality working together to create one building that represents a new South Africa. The building's architectural identity is expressing that yes, there were differences in the past, such as apartheid, but now let us work together in unison to create a better future for South Africa.
Materiality. A very important first note in order to understand the use of certain materials in the complex is that the site is situated in a very remote location. The park is a 10-hour drive from Johannesburg, so all material that was brought to site had an added financial and environmental cost. This suggested a solution of local materials, which fit naturally with the program requirements. Due to the high financial cost of having to transport steel to the site, the need for minimizing steel was of great importance. This obviously led to some interesting and unique architectural design, construction methods, and materials used. The center has been described as being a building that is built from the earth that it sits on. The complex landscape was both the inspiration for the design and the source of most of the materials for its construction, resulting in a composition of structures that are authentically rooted to their location. Both floor plans and sections reflect the natural landscape, and this can be seen in the curving and organic shapes meant to imitate the curved nature of the boulders and rock formations around the site. The poverty relief program for the building project was such an important issue that SANParks wished to address, that Peter Rich Architects created a design that would center the building elements solely around people, meaning that most of the materials used in the complex were gathered and created by the local people. The building is constructed of locally made pressed soil cement tiles, which are then used to form the three thin-shelled structural tile vaults of the roof. These tiled vaults are shells that act in pure compression that are unreinforced by any kind of steel. Simple timber formwork was placed just as a guide for the workers when placing the tiles. The 700-year-old Mediterranean vaulting tradition used to construct the vaults allows the complex shapes to be built by newly trained workers without extensive formwork. Over 200,000 pressed soil cement tiles were made for the project and form the main material that was used throughout the entire complex. The tile vaults rely on fast-setting gypsum mortar and thin tiles laid on edge. This Mediterranean type of vaulting is called Catalan or Gustavino vaulting, and commonly known as timbrel vaulting in South Africa. By adapting elements of Mediterranean architecture in a structural and symbolic way, it can respect the African climate and perform correctly under the harsh conditions. Over 60 women were trained to make the earth tiles, and over 100 men trained to construct the vaults of the center. It is important also to note that the tile making process proceeded for an entire year before any other work on site began. The tiles are made of local earth and sand mixed with 5% cement and pressed using a modified hydroform block press. The modification allows thin tile production from a standard press on reusable plywood blanks. The tiles are weak but strong enough for the structural application. They must be handled carefully and are susceptible to damage from transport and water. Although the tiles have some disadvantages, for the Interpretation Center project they were the most appropriate solution to building in the local context. The structural forms of the shells were designed to have low stresses of about 1.5 MPa, acting in compression only, because the soil cement tiles can only withstand about 5 MPa. As one can see, the design of the complex was very much centered around the structural properties and capabilities of the materials used. The large openings cut out of the vaults are protected from glare by polycarbonate sheeting and eucalyptus stalks, and from baboons with iron grills, based on the pattern of canidoot plants growing in the courtyard below. The vaults are footed on thick sandstone walls. The surfacing and finishing of all of the masonry tiles was cladded in local rubble stone, which creates a timeless quality, as if they had erupted from the earth in a geological event similar to that which created the site area. The floors were constructed using local rubble stone, mixed with cement to achieve a rough, natural aesthetic. Reeds were used to cover the semi-open spaces throughout the complex and provide the necessary shade in the hot climate of Mapungubwe. Except for the cement added to the earth to give the tiles strength and used in the mortar beds between the layers of tiles, all materials, including earth, sand, gravel, and stones, came from within a few kilometers of the building site. By reducing and eliminating steel in the vault construction, a longer lifespan can be achieved without the concern over deterioration due to corrosion. It is clearly evident that the materials of the complex and the construction methods used have contributed to the design being fully rooted in the genius loci of the natural location, as well as being perceived as a place that is deeply connected to the histories of the past kingdom that it is celebrating. Although it may not make any direct architectural reference to the culture, it has a remarkable way of not needing to, because of how well it does reference the Mapungubwe kingdom in its materials and construction.
According to the architect Peter Rich, the centre symbolizes Africa before colonialism, its ancient cultures and mythologies. The intent of the architect was to create a space that is sacred with a fascinating mystic approach to the layering of richness and true intent. A storybook type of space, evoking the imagination of occupants, wanting them to be within the journey of space in time. The building serves as a clear symbolic quality and concept of its context, an eccentric African space with admirable connectivity in becoming one with its natural surroundings and history. In an interview, Rich claims that during the construction of the building, not all the bricks in the vaulted roof structure lined up correctly, and then bricks had to be cut to close the dome-like roof, resulting in an irregular junction, adding a richness and a meaningful delight in the storytelling intent of the space. He works with the extension of the landscape, stating that some of the most remarkable architecture is the ones that are invisible. Rich found his inspiration through the mesmerizing landscape, focusing on the authentic nature, following the forces rather than going against it, as he compares a branch of a tree to the economy rather than aesthetic. The same parabolic nature is pulled through the architecture of the building, representing its connotation to the history and character of the site. Set in a spectacular and remote landscape on the border of South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe, the Mapungubwe Interpretation Center attracted attention to a historic archaeological site where the remains of an ancient civilization, along with an abundance of artifacts, were found. The archaeological site has since been brought back to life through the build of the Interpretation Center. The history of the area is promoted through the building in a very literal way, as the construction techniques used in this project directly links to the culture of Africa and the building traditions of the Ndebele people. By using these native techniques, it is clear that the agenda of the project definitely extended beyond wanting to awaken an understanding among people about the vulnerability of the local ecology. It wants to serve as a reminder of the historical area and the culture that existed there, and possibly bring back a piece of that culture for people to appreciate. The exterior of the structure and vaulted domes were designed to reflect the hilly landscape of Mapungubwe, and fits in like an element that comes across as if it was supposed to be there from the beginning. The other primary reference used when the form of the building was designed was the cairn, a structure made from stone that was used in Zimbabwe as a guide on a traveling route. From another point of view, the interpretation center may look like an ancient artifact arising out from the year's worth of layers of land. The domes connect the different structures so that they look like a range of prehistoric caves in the landscape. All the elements of the building, namely the integration of the building and the landscape, the subtle and not so subtle presence of references to the cultural heritage of the area, and finally, how it ties to the historical site and artifacts all connect to create an inseparable unity.
In conclusion, the Mapungubwe Interpretation Center is authentically rooted to its location, focusing on the figurative symbolism of the mysterious storytelling landscape and architecture, placing great attention for the building to be one with nature rather than standing out for the purpose of aesthetic. The architects placed tremendous focus merging the archaeology, ecology, simplicity, history, storytelling, and mode of making in the design. A rather naturalist way of making, using natural elements rather than a modernist approach. A building invisible in nature. It clearly enhances the unique African space, architecture, and experience. Thank you. Please feel free to ask any questions.